Lavengro, Chapter 2. I have been a wanderer the greater part of my life. Indeed, I remember only 2 periods, and these by no means lengthy, when I was, strictly speaking, stationary. I was a soldier's son, and as the means of my father were by no means sufficient to support 2 establishments, his family invariably attended him wherever he went, so that from my infancy I was accustomed to travelling and wandering, and looked upon a monthly change of scene and residence as a matter of course. Sometimes we lived in barracks, sometimes in lodgings, but generally in the former, always eschewing the latter from motives of economy, save when the barracks were inconvenient and uncomfortable, and they must have been highly so indeed to have discouraged us from entering them, for though we were gentry, bear that in mind, gentle reader, gentry by birth, and incontestably so by my father's bearing the commission of good old George III, we were not fine gentry, but people who could put up with as much as any genteel Scotch family who find it convenient to live on a 3rd floor in London, or on a 6th at Edinburgh or Glasgow. It was not a little that could discourage us. We once lived within the canvas walls of a camp at a place called Pett, in Sussex, and I believe it was at this place that occurred the first circumstance, or adventure, call it what you will, that I can remember in connection with myself. It was a strange one, and I will relate it. It happened that my brother and myself were playing one evening in a sandy lane, in the neighbourhood of this Pett camp. Our mother was at a slight distance. All of a sudden, a bright yellow, and to my infantine eye, beautiful and glorious object made its appearance at the top of the bank, from between the thick quickset, and gliding down, began to move across the lane to the other side, like a line of golden light. Uttering a cry of pleasure, I sprang forward and seized it, nearly by the middle. A strange sensation of numbing coldness seemed to pervade my whole arm, which surprised me the more as the object to the eye appeared so warm and sun-like. I did not drop it, however, but holding it up, looked at it intently. As its head dangled about a foot from my hand, it made no resistance. I felt not even the slightest struggle. But now my brother began to scream and shriek like one possessed. "Oh, mother, mother," said he, "the viper! My brother has a viper in his hand." He then, like one frantic, made an effort to snatch the creature away from me. The viper now hissed amain, and raised its head, in which were eyes like hot coals, menacing not myself but my brother. I dropped my captive, for I saw my mother running towards me, and the reptile, after standing for a moment nearly erect and still hissing furiously, made off and disappeared. The whole scene is now before me as vividly as if it occurred yesterday. The gorgeous viper, my poor dear frantic brother, my agitated parent, and a frightened hen clucking under the bushes. And yet I was not 3 years old. It is my firm belief that certain individuals possess an inherent power or fascination over certain creatures. Otherwise I should be unable to account for many feats which I have witnessed, and indeed borne a share in, connected with the taming of brutes and reptiles. I have known a savage and vicious mare, whose stall it was dangerous to approach, even when bearing provender, welcome nevertheless, with every appearance of pleasure, an uncouth wiry-headed man, with a frightfully seamed face, and an iron hook supplying the place of his right arm, one whom the animal had never seen before, playfully bite his hair and cover his face with gentle and endearing kisses. And I have already stated how a viper would permit without resentment one child to take it up in his hand, whilst it showed its dislike to the approach of another by the fiercest hissings. Philosophy can explain many strange things, but there are some which are far pitch above her, and this is one. I should scarcely relate another circumstance which occurred about this time, but for a singular effect which it produced upon my constitution. Up to this period I had been rather a delicate child, whereas almost immediately after the occurrence to which I allude, I became both hale and vigorous, to the great astonishment of my parents, who naturally enough expected that it would produce quite a contrary effect. It happened that my brother and myself were disporting ourselves in certain fields near the good town of Canterbury. A female servant had attended us, in order to take care that we came to no mischief. She, however, it seems, had matters of her own to attend to, and allowing us to go where we listed, remained in one corner of a field, in earnest conversation with a red-coated dragoon. Now it chanced to be blackberry time, and the two children wandered under the hedges, peering anxiously among them in quest of that trash so grateful to urchins of their degree. We did not find much of it, however, and were soon separated in the pursuit. All at once I stood still, and could scarcely believe my eyes. I had come to a spot where, almost covering the hedge, hung clusters of what seemed fruit, deliciously tempting fruit, something resembling grapes of various colours, green, red, and purple. Dear me, thought I, how fortunate! Yet have I a right to gather it? Is it mine? For the observance of the law of meum and tuum had early been impressed upon my mind, and I entertained, even at that tender age, the utmost horror for theft. So I stood staring at the variegated clusters, in doubt as to what I should do. I know not how I argued the matter in my mind. The temptation, however, was at last too strong for me, so I stretched forth my hand and ate. I remember perfectly well that the taste of this strange fruit was by no means so pleasant as the appearance, but the idea of eating fruit was sufficient for a child, and after all the flavour was much superior to that of sour apples. So I ate voraciously. How long I continued eating I scarcely know. One thing is certain, that I never left the field as I entered it, being carried home in the arms of the dragoon in strong convulsions, in which I continued for several hours. About midnight I awoke, as if from a troubled sleep, and beheld my parents bending over my couch, whilst the regimental surgeon, with a candle in his hand, stood nigh, the light feebly reflected on the whitewashed walls in the barrack room. Another circumstance connected with my infancy, and I have done, I need offer no apology for relating it, as it subsequently exercised considerable influence over my pursuits. We were, if I remember right, in the vicinity of a place called Hythe in Kent. One sweet evening, in the latter part of summer, our mother took her two little boys by the hand for a wander about the fields. In the course of our stroll, we came to the village church. An old grey-headed sexton stood on the porch, who, perceiving that we were strangers, invited us to enter. We were presently in the interior, wandering about the aisles, looking on the walls and inspecting the monuments of the notable dead. I can scarcely state what we saw. How should I? I was a child, not yet 4 years old, and yet I think I remember the evening sun streaming in through a stained window upon the dingy mahogany pulpit, and flinging a rich lustre upon the faded tints of an ancient banner. And now once more we were outside the building, where, against the wall, stood a low-eaved penthouse, into which we looked. It was half filled with substances of some kind, which at first looked like large grey stones. The greater part were lying in layers. Some, however, were seen in confused and mouldering heaps, and 2 or 3, which had perhaps rolled down from the rest, lay separately on the floor. "Skulls, madam," said the sexton, "skulls of the old Danes. Long ago they came pirating into these parts, and then there chanced a mighty shipwreck, for God was angry with them, and he sunk them, and their skulls, as they came ashore, were placed here as a memorial. There were many more when I was young, but now they are fast disappearing. Some of them must have belonged to strange fellows, madam. Only see that one. Why, the 2 young gentry can scarcely lift it, and indeed my brother and myself had entered the Golgotha and commenced handling these grim relics of mortality. One enormous skull lying in a corner had fixed our attention, and we had drawn it forth. Spirit of Eld, what a skull was yon! I still seem to see it, the huge grim thing. Many of the others were large, strikingly so, and appeared fully to justify the old man's conclusion that their owners must have been strange fellows. But compared with this mighty mass of bone, they looked small and diminutive, like those of pygmies. It must have belonged to a giant, one of those red-haired warriors of whose strength and stature such wondrous tales are told in the ancient chronicles of the north, and whose grave hills, when ransacked, occasionally reveal secrets which fill the minds of puny moderns with astonishment and awe. Reader, have you ever pored days and nights over the pages of Snorro? Probably not, for he wrote in a language which few of the present day understand, and few would be tempted to read him tamed down by Latin dragomans. A brave old book is that of Snorro, containing the histories and adventures of old northern kings and champions, who seemed to have been quite different men, if we may judge from the feats which they performed, from those of these days. One of the best of his histories is that which describes the life of Harold Hardrad, who, after manifold adventures by land and sea, now a pirate, now a mercenary of the Greek emperor, became king of Norway, and eventually perished at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, whilst engaged in a gallant onslaught upon England. Now I have often thought that the old Kemp, whose mouldering skull in the Golgotha at Hythe my brother and myself could scarcely lift, must have resembled in one respect at least this Harold. Ah, yes, Harold, whom Snorro describes as a great and wise ruler and a determined leader, dangerous in battle and fair presence, and measuring in height just 5 ells, neither more nor less. I never forgot the Daneman's skull. Like the apparition of the viper in the sandy lane, it dwelt in the mind of the boy, affording copious food for the exercise of his imagination. From that moment, with the name of Dane, were associated strange ideas of strength, daring, and superhuman stature, and an undefinable curiosity for all that is connected with the Danish race began to pervade me. And if, long after, when I became a student, I devoted myself with particular zest to Danish law and the acquirement of the Old Norse tongue and its dialects, I can only explain the matter by the early impression received at Hythe from the tale of the old sexton beneath the penthouse and the sight of the Danish skull. And thus we went on straying from place to place, at Hythe today, and perhaps within a week, looking out from our hostel window upon the streets of Old Winchester, our motions ever in accordance with the route of the regiment, so habituated to change of scene that it had become almost necessary to our existence. Pleasant were these days of my early boyhood, and a melancholy pleasure steals over me as I recall them. Those were stirring times of which I am speaking, and there was much passing around me calculated to captivate the imagination. The dreadful struggle which so long convulsed Europe, and in which England bore so prominent a part, was then at its hottest. We were at war, and determination and enthusiasm shone in every face. Man, woman, and child were eager to fight the Frank, the hereditary, but thank God, never dreaded enemy of the Anglo-Saxon race. Love your country and beat the French, and then never mind what happens, was the cry of entire England. Oh, those were days of power, gallant days, bustling days, worth the bravest days of chivalry at least. Tall battalions of native warriors were marching through the land. There was a glitter of the bayonet and the gleam of the sabre. The shrill shriek of the fife and the loud rattling of the drum were heard in the streets of country towns, and the loyal shouts of the inhabitants greeted the soldiery on their arrival or cheered them at their departure. And now let us leave the upland and descend to the seaboard. There is a sight for you upon the billows. A dozen men of war are gliding majestically out of port, their long buntings streaming from the top-gallant masts, calling on the skulking Frenchman to come forth from his bights and bays. And what looms upon us yonder from the fog-bank in the east? A gallant frigate, towing behind her the long low hull of a crippled privateer, which but 3 short days ago had left Dieppe to skim the sea, and whose crew of ferocious hearts are now cursing their imprudence in an English hold. Stirring times those, which I love to recall, for they were days of gallantry and enthusiasm, and were moreover the days of my boyhood. End of chapter 2.